Welcome, everybody, to part 3 of GMAT Club's 3-part series about how to improve your GMAT score, which, when you think about it, is really at the heart of what GMAT Club is doing. This part, I'm going to cover data insights. So part 1 with my inestimable colleague, Chris Gentry, covered quant. You can find the link for that under the video. Part 2, covered by my less inestimable colleague, me, covered verbal, and you can also find the link for that. This is part 3 of 3, data insights. You guys, GMAT Club is embarking on a whole new quarter of content, and so if there's anything you've been wanting to see in terms of these YouTube videos, put that in the comments. GMAT Club reads them, sometimes I read them, and then I cry. Either way, welcome. So here we go. How to go from, and this is what it says, data insight score of 78, about the average, and it's a pretty high average because data insights is difficult. It's where the 50th percentile is anyway, to a DI90. And anybody who's seen me in another video about data insights, particularly one of me doing a data insights section, will know I have no idea how to get to a 90 on data insights. It's still a work in progress. Data insights is a very hard section, but I'm going to give you what I hope will be the best tips for studying effectively for data insights so that you can at least move into the 80s, high 80s maybe a 90. All right, fingers crossed. Let's do this thing. So if for some reason this is the very first of the 3 videos you're watching and you don't even know what the GMAT is, you're about to find out real quick. It is a test. It consists of 3 sections, and indeed these are the 3 sections that, as of the end of this session, we will have covered in this series: quant, for verbal, and now data insights. And as you can see, data insights is a 20 problem section, theoretically the shortest of the 3 sections in terms of number of questions, but no less short in terms of time. They are all, if you're under standard timing, 45 minutes long. And so what that tells you is data insights questions, on the whole, take a little bit longer than, say, quant or verbal questions. You will have an option about which order to do the sections in. Most people would recommend that you break up quant and data insights when you choose that order with the break in between. All right. So that's all the big general GMAT stuff out of the way. Let's get into some data insights. And you guys, as always in these sessions, if you have questions, if you have comments while we're doing it, if you want to answer any question that happens to be on screen, you are always welcome to do so, invited to do so, encouraged to do so, because honestly, your comments are my favorite part. All right, here we go. First thing to know, most important thing to know, data insights is such drama. It's such drama. There are so many types of questions, right? Specifically, there are 5 types of questions. You've got data sufficiency questions, which anybody who's been acquainted with the GMAT for a while knows used to be on the quant section, but now find themselves on the data insights section. And then there's the kind of repurposed integrated reasoning section from the older version of the GMATs. The tables, the graphs, the 2 parts, the MSRs, all show up on this current data insights section in roughly the same numbers that they showed up in the IR section from before. That said, you can sometimes get second MSR thing with 3 extra questions. You can sometimes get a 5th 2-part thing. I've written the kind of typical numbers of problems you should expect to see in each category down here, but this is all give or take at least 1, and in the case of MSR, give or take 3, right? And the reason I bring this up is because step 1 to improving at data insights, you got to know the question types and subtypes. If this is your first time seeing the data insights section, this is going to be a lot because I'm going to talk a lot about the subtypes of questions that are out there and, of course, the types of questions. But you need to know that stuff. You need to know that stuff to strategize effectively. Not every question is going to be your question. Certainly, if you're going for that 90, every question needs to be your question to some degree. But if you're going for a respectable score on data insights, 85, 86, 87, a really decent score on data insights, higher than I've gotten, you don't need to be doing everything, but you need to be strategic about which ones you maybe skip or educated guess on, things like that, right? And so to do that effectively, and especially as you're studying and trying to improve on data insights, The only way you can really do it is if you know the different subtypes of questions, because you don't want to say, oh, I'm like bad at two-part questions, I should skip them all. You can't afford to, there are too many of them. But if you can drill down to like, I'm bad at two-part questions when they ask about, say, combinatorics. I'm bad at two-part questions when they're logic type or something like that. Then you can make more precise decisions about which ones are more or less worth your time on kind of a case-by-case basis as you do the test. So we're going to start by talking about the types and subtypes of questions, just to familiarize you all with types if you don't know them, but subtypes even if you have been working with this stuff for a while. And then we're going to talk about just techniques, strategies, things to watch out for in Data Insights, as kind of indicated by the whole rest of this list. All right, buckle up, especially if you're watching this video from a car. All right, so recognition. Now, what's going to happen will be a bit alarming. I'm going to cycle through a pretty good number of questions right now, and a lot of these questions we're going to return to and discuss in more depth. But what I'm saying is, as these questions show up on screen, don't get too attached to them. Like all things, they are impermanent for the time being. All right. And we're going to go roughly in order. So data sufficiency, we're going to look at tables, then graphs, then MSRs, then two parts. Pay no attention to the fact that tables is for some reason in green. Tables just like to be different. All right. Data sufficiency can take what the GMAT will call two different forms. All right. The GMAT basically breaks all of these types of questions down into two subtypes: math-related, non-math related. You've taken one of the mock exams, you'll see that kind of categorization on each question in the Data Insights section, and it's pretty serviceable. But the non-math related questions can be further subdivided, I find, into two kind of sub-categories. Not perfectly delineated, but pretty well delineated. Non-math related questions can be more verbal-based, testing your verbal skills, the same skills as in the true verbal section, reading comprehension, critical reasoning. Or they can be logic-based, testing kind of formal logic, giving you a kind of explicit set of rules or constraints and asking you to apply that specific set of rules and constraints, do a lot of inference and stuff like that, right? The more natural the language is in the question, the more it feels as though it's maybe like telling a story or, set in kind of a real world type thing, the more likely it is to be a verbal one. And again, it's not such a big distinction in all these questions, like data sufficiency verbal versus data sufficiency logic. They're pretty close to each other. It's really just a kind of a difference in voice. But some of the other types, you see a real distinction between the verbal and the logic types, especially as we'll see in two-part questions. This one's kind of verbal. It's very natural, right? There are some constraints here, right? 15-minute break, 1 p.m. to 4:30 p.m., hour-long meetings, 3 people, etc. But it's not like so many rules or such abstract rules that they need to kind of bullet it out or that there will be a huge amount of confusion about it. Pretty easy to take notes on, probably somewhat easy to apply to the statements, and the statements are absolutely presented in a verbally sort of way. Now, to contrast that with a more logic-based one, this one ends up being a bit more of a logic-based one. And really the only difference in it is it's focused a bit more on arrangements, on ordering of things, on matchings of things, and so on. But still incredibly verbal. And that's why the GMAT cheekily just puts them both under non-math related and calls it a day. Again, you may not find that you have any significant difference in abilities between data sufficiency verbal and data sufficiency logic, but I want to keep the distinction because it's definitely more useful for some of the other question types. Okay. The one thing that is true for both of these data sufficiency non-math related ones is the math required is going to be very light. Instead, you're going to be diagramming, you're going to be making a lot of inferences, you're going to be taking notes, you're going to be seeing things beyond what's explicitly said there to get to what they're really trying to get at. All right. Contrast that with, of course, math related, the math types. You can kind of tell from the jump whether a data sufficiency question is math related. A lot of them happen to deal with statistics, as this problem does, but they can deal with anything, a lot of percents problems there, and different varieties as well. They have started moving away more and more from true abstract math in data sufficiency questions because the overall tenor of the data insights section is to test your verbal skills alongside your quantitative skills. That's why basically none of the problems in data insights will be like a straight algebra problem. It'll always be, at least initially, like a word problem, that sort of thing, because that's the way they've always tested verbal skills alongside quant skills. But some of them are definitely more quantitatively focused, like this one. They'd require formulas, they'd require quantitative knowledge. They test, problems in the same sort of way, test things in the same sort of way that quant problems will test them, right? You can imagine a quant problem much like this, in which instead of setting it up as data sufficiency, they just give you one or both of those pieces of information in the body of the problem, all right? And that's going to be one of the big themes on data insights as well. A lot of skills from verbal and quant carry over to data insights. Formats are different. Your need to sift through information is definitely different. And the logic type that shows up here is a departure from the quant and verbal sections. It's pretty unique at this point to the data insights section. But in terms of data insights, quant and verbal type questions, you're carrying skills straight over from the quant and verbal sections, respectively. That's another reason it helps to make this delineation between the more verbal types and the more logic types, so that you can see what skills carry over a bit more clearly. Right. Those are 3 ways problems can go just on data sufficiency level. Looking at some of the other types, so now tables, right? I confess, have a true logic type table, but I'll describe them a little bit. I do, however, have a math type table, right? One of the ways you can tell a math type table right away, bunch of numbers in it, bunch of numbers. But the surest way to know that you got a math type table is the statements down below, the things you have to choose yes or no for, true or false for, require some math. They have math keywords in them. They require some calculation. Remember, on the data insights section, you do have access to an on-screen calculator. You should absolutely freely use it. It's nice. You don't have it in quant, and most troublingly, perhaps, you don't have it in verbal. So take advantage of it while it's here on data insights. A more verbal table question going to look like this. And one of the things to notice about it is, yeah, like technically there's a bit of numbering on this table, right? There's a column that's got numbers on it. Cool. But the other columns, they have words and descriptions in them, right? And the questions, the statements down here are really about finding those words and seeing if the statement is true as you follow those kind of keywords through the table. More on that later, because that's going to be really the nuts and bolts of how you have to approach data insights. Keywords, reading for them well, double checking for them, etc. Things you might have noticed lower down on that list of 5 things for data insights, all right? So we're coming back a little bit later. Now, just to note, a logic-based table question will often feel pretty different from this and pretty different from the mathy ones. Now, a logic-based table question, a table can be full of numbers, it can be full of words, it can be a combination of the two, though that's a little bit more rare. But one thing that they do in logic-based table questions a lot is kind of explicitly set them not in the real world, right? Like this one is set literally at the Sundance Film Festival in 2005. It doesn't get any more real world than that, and they may not be quite that specific in their real world settings of table questions on the actual exam. This is one of our questions at Manhattan Prep, but the logic-based table questions are the kind of most abstract, because while they might give you numbers in those logic-based table questions, or they might give you like sometimes just asterisks in the cells or dots in the cells or any number of things, they're not giving you numbers that you usually do math with. They're not giving you numbers that represent like real things out there in the real world the way that these numbers in this math-based table question do, right? These are actual numbers of BTUs, British thermal units. For all these things, these are actual numbers. Coal is an actual thing in the world, I'm told. Never seen it myself. All right. So very real world. A logic-based table would have something like a setup that kind of makes it feel like a bit of a game, a bit detached from the real world. For instance, there's a question out there in which a dude, let's call him Jorge, has to visit his like 6 clients A through F every single day that he's working. I assume it'd be weird otherwise. And they give you this table with numbers of kilometers between his different clients, and then they give you kind of an algorithm to follow whereby he schedules each meeting based on which client is the least distance from the meeting immediately prior, the client immediately prior to that meeting. And so you're supposed to kind of get an order of things from that table based on the different distances they give you and the description of how to get that order from what'll be the blurb, right? That's the way a logic one will go. Not a lot of math required, but there is going to be a lot of putting things in order or pairing things up on those questions, right? And that also is a very different action from what you're usually doing on table questions in the quantitative ones like this. In the verbal ones like this, you're basically following these statements and looking to find the relevant information and just report on that relevant information, all right? In table ones, the statements themselves are not, or sorry, in logic-based ones, the statements themselves are not usually sentences necessarily. They're like names of things, very short things, and it's more about the action of the table. Right. Moving on. Next type and how it can play out. The next type we look at is graphs. Graphs and tables. Here's a reminder, graphs next. Graphs and tables are grouped together by the GMAT, just as verbal and logic types are grouped together by the GMAT. All right, they put tables and graphs together because there is a lot of overlap in tables and graphs, both in that you know, in a professional setting might well see tables and graphs in the very same presentation a lot of the time. Tables and graphs can represent very similar information. Tables and graphs are open to math questions that test a lot of the same concepts, right? Averages, percentages, medians, and other statistic stuff, ratios, that sort of thing, all right? So tables and graphs very much grouped together by GMAT. Now that said, you don't have to think of them as grouped together because you're trying to get a pretty fine grade differentiation among these types so that you can strategize in a way that's effective for you. So if you're like, well, the GMAT tells me tables and graphs go together, but why is it that every time I see a table question, I'm spending 5 minutes, and every time I see a graph question, I'm getting it done in 1 minute? It's because it's different for you, and you're trying to get to know these different types to find out what you're good at and what you're bad at so that you can strategize. And ideally, at the end, you get good at everything, but still, when you do go in to take the test, you want to be extremely pragmatic about where you're at. If you know you just haven't cracked table questions in, say, under 3 minutes ever, then they could be possibly good candidates for skips and returns because they're otherwise going to take you more time than you'd want to spend, right? All right, so graph questions. Again, a couple of varieties. Now, in graph questions, there's a bit less of a distinction between verbal and logic again, but I will say that logic questions will often look like this. Some kind of organizational diagram, some kind of flow chart, right? Very, very common in graph-based logic questions. Whereas the verbal ones, they can kind of look the same, or they can look a bit like more classic graphs. But the one thing that logic and verbal graphs, non-math related graphs, tend to have in common on the GMAT is that they will usually be weird looking. They're not going to be the kind of graphs you would necessarily have seen a lot of in presentations at work or wherever you get your favorite presentations. They will be kind of bespoke, right? Like this one, I think if you show up to work with this graph in a presentation, you're raising more questions than you might feel comfortable answering, right? But compare that to this one. This is legit. You could show up at work with this. Nobody's going to look askance at you if you show up with a graph like this. It's a bar graph. Yeah, there's a little bit of stacking going on. But if that's the most exotic thing you see in a graph, it's not that bad, right? And you'll notice, because this is a more normal looking graph, often you'll get a shorter blurb under it. This one has still a pretty lengthy blurb to explain some stuff, but often you'll get a shorter blurb. And then the questions down here will be more math focused. I know I don't have drop downs, but this dropdown would have been a percentage. Graph questions have dropdowns in them. This dropdown has percentage options in it. And that lets you know, obviously, you're in math town. Also, this one's talking about proportions, right? So again, very mathy questions based on whatever is in the graph. And still the skill is to get the key information you need from the graph and look at it. It just plays out a little bit differently, all right? And again, we'll come back and we're going to see some of these and talk about precisely how these things play out, right? MSRs, aka my nemesis. Do not love MSRs myself. I hear that sentiment is shared amongst the people, and if you feel the same, we are each other's people, all right? MSRs are lengthy, and I know for my part, I end up taking a long time on them. Unfortunately, MSRs, multi-source reasoning questions, also have the this kind of feature whereby you almost have to do them because they come bundled. One prompt comes bundled with 3 questions in a row. You could theoretically skip all 3 questions, get to the end of the data insights section, return, and change your answers on those questions. I mean, like skip in the sense of guess quickly, move on quickly, bookmark for review later. But it's a bit dangerous because one thing that going back to questions at the end of a section on the GMAT doesn't necessarily do for you is repair any hits that your kind of score trajectory has taken over time. And typically, if you get 3 questions wrong in a row, that's putting you kind of on a lower bracket of difficulty. They're giving you easier questions for a while, and it can be somewhat difficult then to fight your way back to harder questions and really get a top score. So even though I want it to be a great candidate to skip MSR, it tends to be one of the less good candidates to skip, right? Because of the fact that it's bundled. It's like skipping reading comprehension in the verbal section. You skip one passage, you're skipping usually 3 or 4 questions in a row, and it really is hard to come back from that. You really, on data insights, want to, if you're going to skip questions, you very well might, you want to do that on kind of one-off questions, which are all the other ones, just not MSR, right? MSR, like the other types, can take a couple of forms, non-math related and math related. This time, just to spice things up a little bit, I have 2 examples, both of them non-math related, so that we can see the distinction between more verbal ones and more logic-based ones, all right? Math-related ones are pretty clearly math-related. They've got numbers on them. They've got often tables on 1 or 2 of the tabs, graphs on 1 or 2 of the tabs, things like that. But numbers and number-based or math-based statements down below to have to respond to, all right? This one, though, would instead be an example of a verbal one, because if you check out all these tabs, there's the first tab right there, email 1, you can probably tell from the very suggestive titles of the other 2 tabs that you're in for a bit of an email fest here, right? Which means you're probably like not seeing tables or graphs on any of these tabs, because who out there is emailing people a bunch of tables and graphs just embedded into the email? Not this guy, that's for sure. Take a look at tab 2, lots of words, right? Like a passage. Take a look at tab 3, few words, but still a passage, right? This is a very verbal back and forth. Now, within this stuff, there are some things involving math. You can kind of tell in that first statement down there that there's some calculation to do. There's definitely like potentially overlap between these things. I mean, to some degree, all questions require logic on the exam, right? But this one is what you might call verbal forward, right? The information is communicated in longer text, and that is a very verbal thing to do. The statements down below are complete sentences, and that is, again, a very verbal look for questions. All right. Contrast that with an example of an MSR logic prompt. And these can go different ways. I've seen on real tests an MSR logic prompt having very few words, and like 1 tab had a table, 1 tab had a flowchart, 1 tab had a table, again, that sort of thing. Another hallmark, though, of logic-based questions, and this is true for MSR and for 2-part analysis questions, is you're sometimes given like a bulleted list or just a kind of list of conditions, especially on the first tab. All right, you see something like that, and there is a good chance that you're looking at a logic-based MSR question. Not, again, necessarily a huge distinction between that and verbal, but it's different in the way the information is presented. And so to some degree, it's different in the kind of skills they're going to play out. Logic-based questions on data insights are very much about proactive inference, all right? Still the same kind of inference that if you saw the verbal video a week or so ago, you make a lot in verbal. Same kind of inferences, synthesis, converse, application, and stuff like that. but it's on overdrive in the logic ones. Whatever they tell you, like whatever rule or constraint they give you, you're often only using it to infer something else from it. And sometimes you have to make chains of inferences and stuff like that, right? So it's a bit more intense in terms of the inference required than typical verbal questions are, but still a lot of the same skills. All right, and just to give you a sense of what's on the other tab, it also has kind of a numbered list of kind of conditions or circumstances or things like that, right? And again, that's pretty consistent with the logic type. Again, you guys, I'll invite you. Ask questions, pop things into the chat window, hit me with some comments, and I can pivot to whatever you want to talk about too. But to round this part of our adventure out, the last kind of question on Data Insights, two-part analysis questions. Typically you see 4, but it could be 5, it could be 6. It really depends on which experimental questions they decide to give you on any given test, right? So if they, if they want to test you on 4 two-part questions, but they feel like they should give an experimental one just to kind of gauge how hard that experimental one is, you could see 5 or, theoretically fewer. Usually not. All right. Two-part analysis questions are the most like questions in other sections. All right. So for instance, no, we'll come to that in a second. A two-part verbal-based question like this one will often look just like a CR question, right? You can see from the column headings here, strengthen and weaken. If you've been studying verbal at all, you know that those are critical reasoning question stems, right? Which of the following if true would most strengthen the argument? Which of the following if true would most weaken the argument? And these answer choices as well are very akin to critical reasoning answer choices. Really, the only distinction between this type of question and a true critical reasoning question is that instead of picking one answer, which you will do on all verbal critical reasoning questions, like critical reasoning questions on the verbal section, for these two-part analysis questions, you have to pick 2 answers, a strengthener and a weakener. So it's 2 tasks kind of coming off the same text, the same argument, but that's just basically critical reasoning with like a tiny bit more. No big thing. All right. Two-part quant questions. Very much like normal quant questions, with a couple of exceptions. One, of course, the same. You have to answer 2 kind of question stems at the end and not just one, right? Like a typical quant question might end up at, what's the value of X? Or what's the value of Y? Or even like an aggregate, what's the value of X plus Y or X minus Y or something like that, or X over Y? These two-part quant questions will just ask for X and Y both, or X and X plus Y or something like that. So again, not a huge amount more work required to do the problem. Like even if it's a quant question and it's just asking for X, you're often getting both X and Y in such situations, but there are 2 things to answer and that's it. Now, one other key difference between two-part quant questions and normal quant questions is that you often see language like this. Identify values of X and Y that are consistent or are jointly consistent with the given information, with the information provided, stuff like that. That tends to mean you have to at some point use the answer choices to make a decision. And we'll have a bit more on this later because we're going to talk about this problem in a little bit of depth. But that is something that doesn't typically happen on the quant section. On the quant section, you often have the option of using the answer choices in kind of a lead way if you want to, back solving or working backwards. But there are not that many questions on the quant section which you have to. About half your two-part quant questions are going to be like this. They're going to ask what's jointly consistent. And what they're really saying there is, we haven't given you quite enough information up top to solve to a definitive pair of values, but we have given you enough information up there to establish a relationship. And now you're going to want to see which pair of values down below follows that relationship. All right. Oh, Pranchal, I'm going to answer that question really soon, but the short answer is data sufficiency. I would say data sufficiency. Unless they are like a true strength of yours, they are usually the best candidate to skip. Two-part questions or table questions can be next best candidate to skip. I'm hesitant to say table questions because a lot of people get them right. They just take time doing so. But two-part questions can take long. Certainly like the logic ones and stuff can take long. And so those might be good candidates to skip. But a bit more detail on why is forthcoming. All right, so Stay tuned, my friend. Great question, Sanket. And I think we'll come back to that one and talk about why MSR might be a bit low. The basic answer is just it's an abundance of information and it's disjointed, which is not the case for LSAT reading comprehension, where like the passage is all still one cohesive whole. All right. Now, last type / subtype. Oh no, we have two more, right? The two-part verbal questions don't have to look like critical reasoning. They can look a lot more like reading comprehension, and they'll have headings like what's stated and what can be inferred, or what's the cause and what's the effect, or what's the action and what's its goal, or something like that. But all of those questions, and this one included, required and not permitted, are basically just asking you to report on what is said up there, right? Go find the key information, read it carefully, maybe make some inferences just as you would in reading comprehension, but basically report on what's up there. The critical reasoning ones more ask you to like take in new information and apply it to what's up there. And like that's the distinction between critical reasoning and reading comprehension, even in the verbal section. All right. All of this is somewhat differentiated from the logic type questions in that one, logic type questions usually have shorter answer choices, not full sentences, but names plus tags, things like that. Logic-based questions can have, again, these kind of bulleted lists, just like we saw in the logic-based MSR question. They don't have to, but if you see a bulleted list in a two-part question, it's a logic-based one. If you see answers like this, ignoring the 250, don't know why that's still there. Get out of here, 250. That's usually a logic-based question. Don't pick 250 if it shows up like this. It's a red herring. Right? But that's what we're talking about when we talk about logic-based questions. It's going to give you a set of constraints and ask you to apply those constraints to whatever they're asking about in the question stem, to the answer choices directly, that sort of thing. Oh no. And now our friend is gone. We need to bring that bit of the table back. 250 is just going to have to stick around. All right. That's pretty much all the types. I know there are certain types we didn't quite see, right? We didn't see an MSR quant-based one. We didn't truly see a logic-based table question, for instance. But hopefully that gives you an idea of the lay of the land. And again, a big part of why we talk about this is to figure out which ones are good to skip. Now, coming back to that. The reason I say it's a good idea if let's say you're like equally good at everything, it's a good idea to skip data sufficiency questions is one, they are like particularly tricky. To do all your due diligence on a data sufficiency question often takes a pretty good amount of time. And sometimes that is time you do not want to spend. Two, they're one-offs, right? So skipping one data sufficiency question doesn't have any effect on the other ones. This is again why you don't skip MSR questions, because they are very much not one-off. Three, there are so many of them, they tend to be spread out. And so you can kind of like pick and choose in a way that doesn't have you getting 3 questions wrong in a row or almost in a row or something like that, right? They're prevalent throughout the section. They're going to be all over the place. So just anytime you see, uh-oh, I'm a bit behind on time or anything like that, there's a data sufficiency question nearby. And 4, and this one is, I think, like fairly important. You can often make good, quick, educated guesses in data sufficiency in a way that you can't necessarily on, say, a table question where there's just an abundance of information to have to sift through. Graph questions, kinda, you can make decent educated guesses on, in that often the first dropdown is easy to pick for and the second dropdown is hard. And so you might just pick for the first dropdown, guess on the second dropdown, and that's an educated guess. But on data sufficiency, like, look, here's kind of how it goes. Looking at this quant-based one, just because I find it's sometimes easier to see it in quants. And you guys, if you think you know the answer to this one and you want to toss it out there, you're always welcome in the chat window. I'm not here to shame anybody. I just like to know what you guys are thinking. And I find a lot of people get these things right. But look, if we're looking at these two statements, right, and we're just looking at this from an educated guess perspective, we're not really trying to do this problem. We're trying to get in and out in under 30 seconds. And in those 30 seconds, ideally, cut down on some of the answer choices, right? It's very doable in data sufficiency. We would look at the question stem, figure out what we need to know, right? We've got an average. Carson enters the room and nobody leaves. Literally the most ominous wording I've ever seen in a GMAT type question. And it asks, will the average be at least 25 years old? And so if you look at those two statements in terms of like, which one of them is one that you can clearly call sufficient or clearly call insufficient, I think statement 2 has an edge in terms of clearly sufficient, right? Because it's telling you Carson's exact age, right? Statement 1 is giving you a relationship between Carson's age and the age of one of these unknown 5 people who apparently will never leave this room that Carson has just entered. But that's a bit more complicated, right? It might be sufficient. It absolutely might be. And this will be your like own personal kind of educated guessing style. But statement 2 that gives you Carson's like exact age, that one is very, very likely to be sufficient as long as Carson's age is somewhat central to the question. And I would argue that it is from an educated guessing perspective. Carson is the new kid in the room and his age matters, right? He's what's changing the average from the former 20 to the potential now 25 years of age, right? And so if you look at this and you decide pretty quickly, yeah, statement 2, giving me a concrete value, it's an important value, it looks sufficient, right? That gets rid of quite a few answer choices, as people who've been around the block on data sufficiency can tell you. Specifically, it means that B is a possible answer. Statement 2 alone is sufficient. It means that D is a possible answer. Each statement alone might be sufficient. We're not really looking at statement 1 right now. But it does also mean that A, C, and E are out of the running. So if you are looking to save time and a data sufficiency question shows up and you're not feeling like particularly better at data sufficiency than other question types, like data sufficiency is not necessarily your bread and butter, which for me, it definitely isn't. Like I struggle with time, I struggle with accuracy sometimes on data sufficiency, even all this many years into teaching the test. Then it's a great candidate for just a statement 2 looks sufficient. I got B and D. I'll take a look at statement 1 and just say, am I like slightly more persuaded towards its sufficiency or its insufficiency? For my part, I would say because statement 1's making it complicated and statement 2 is just trying to make it dead simple, statement 1 probably has some merit. I've seen enough questions like this in which they're hoping to kind of make the complicated statement so forbidding that you don't necessarily know what math to do on it, don't necessarily want to get tangled up with it, feel like it's not telling you anything because it's not as concrete as the other statement, and all sorts of things that are meant to get in your head and kind of play you into thinking statement 1's just not as good as statement 2. So I'll tend to go the opposite direction. I feel like they're trying to misdirect me on statement 1 here a little bit, trying to make it look worse than statement 2. So I'm going to take it under my wing and I'm probably guessing D, but no matter what, you still got like a 50-50 probably educated guess here. Yeah, maybe there's a chance that statement 2 is super tricky and you make the wrong call on calling it sufficient, but this is, after all, an educated guess and you have to be comfortable with some of the odds. And so the big thing, the big advantage that data sufficiency has over the other question types is just that. You can often tell in a quick glance at the statements whether one at least is going to be definitely insufficient or definitely sufficient. And when you do that, you get rid of 2 or 3 of the answer choices respectively. All right. And then you're guessing 1 out of 3 or 1 out of 2 without much time outlaid. You cannot do much better than that elsewhere in the data insights section. All right. So prevalence of data sufficiency, the difficulty of it for a lot of people, the time consuming nature of it potentially, and the relative ease with which you can often come to an educated guess in data sufficiency, all recommend data sufficiency as a pretty good candidate for educated guessing. But counterbalance that, like the major thing, you guys, is which types are you better at and worse at? Because if data sufficiency is your bread and butter, you shouldn't be skipping data sufficiency questions. You should be preserving the time to get those ones right because you know you're going to get them right. And you should instead be selling off some other questions that you've noticed over time, over practice, over the mocks that you're not as good at. And knowing these different types and subtypes hopefully helps you to establish that pattern a little bit better. So there's not a one size fits all answer to what kind of questions do I think you can skip, Pranchal's question from earlier. But if all things are held equal, data sufficiency is often the best candidate. All right. Your results may vary. And yeah, Anjali, to your question, skip means one has to guess. You're not allowed to just like leave it blank and go to the next question. You have to put a guess in. But when I say skip, I tend to mean you're putting in an answer in like the first 30 seconds, ideally, so that you're still You're spending very little time on it. You're buying back a bunch of time that you might have otherwise spent on that question. And ideally, you're getting an educated guess out of it. But sometimes skipping is just putting in a random guess, especially if it's like you decide to guess on a table question and it's because the table has like 30 rows and you don't feel like you have the time to deal with a 30-row table right now / ever. Then it's maybe just a straight up like guess and move on pretty quickly. But yeah, it's always guess and move on. Bookmark them when you do this, just in case you have time at the end of the section to come back on some of them. You want to know where they are and not be fishing around for them. But that's how it should go. Put in a random thing, hit the bookmark button, next question. And Fariz is absolutely right. This one is D. Okay. Oh, great question. So there's another question. Any tips or resources to get better at reading DI questions outside the OG? Honestly, to get better at it is definitely about practice. And we'll talk about some of this. That's actually kind of the stuff that's lower down on the list. But just like GMAT Club has a huge number of questions of all of these types, separated into math-related and non-math related, but still they're there, and you can at least find more grist for the mill for your practice, if you will, if you go to GMAT Club and their forums. In terms of just getting better skill-wise, that's actually what we're talking about in the rest of this thing. So, coming to it. Getting better skill-wise can break down to a few different components, right? The first is reading in a way that's effective for data insights. So I mentioned that I did a GMAT Club YouTube video a while back of me doing a data insights question from, I think, the official mock number 2. And it's embarrassing. Like, I think I missed like 5 questions on it, maybe 4, maybe 5, something like that. And what you might notice if you watch that video is the reason I missed most of those questions is misreads, right? Like, I read something and then I looked in the wrong place. And that's really easy to do, because one of the things they will do in harder questions on data insights is give things similar names, similar designations. They do this in table questions a lot. They do this in MSR questions a lot, give things similar names. And so, they might say, and this is drawn from an official question, but they might have a column and a table for final exam score and final score. And then they ask you about final score, but it's really easy to accidentally look at final exam score, or vice versa. It's exactly the sort of thing that got me on some of those questions in that particular video. And so reading well is huge. And it's not just reading well in terms of the information provided or anything like that. That's kind of what you'd expect. But a huge part of the challenge in data insights is reading the questions well, reading the statements well. All right. To do that, the things I've found are particularly helpful for me, and this, depends somewhat on the question type, but let's just say in table and graph questions, certainly, and in MSR questions, keywords, reading for keywords. And reading for keywords for me kind of goes like this. Let's look at a table question. Yeah, let's look at a table question. So coming back to this one. Quadrillion BTUs, an astonishing number. Got a lot of numbers here. You got a lot of headings for this table, right? It's year, total production, crude oil, etc. Right? You don't know which ones of those you're going to use. And here, they're not particularly tricky column headings. The thing that makes this table a little tricky and a little easy to mess up is just that the information in all the columns is basically the same kind of information. Compare that to this more verbal question. It's really hard to imagine accidentally looking in the wrong column on this particular question based on whatever is kind of said in the statements down there. Definitely possible, but a little bit harder to imagine because these are all such different types of information, right? You're not going to accidentally think the title of the film was Australia when it's Stackyard versus the King, right? So that sort of thing. Here, again, titles are different, and sometimes the headings for the tables are very, very similar. Here, they're different, but the information is very similar. And so you have to do double checking. And you have to read these statements in pieces. This is what I'm really getting at. So, wrong questions, my bad. Let's come to this one. You have to read these questions in pieces. First one here, these statements. Longer films typically have higher budgets and are therefore better able to afford to use Sony HD. And what they're looking for is, would this help explain what we see in the table, or would this not help explain what we see in the table? Right. Again, sorry for the text here, but they'd explain this more clearly in this text. Keywords here, though. Longer films. And it doesn't necessarily look like it would be such a keyword, but because length is one of the column headings, it's absolutely implicating something in the table. Longer films. So I'd pause there, right? That's a keyword. That's a reference to the table. I'd pause there, and having the ability to sort these tables on the test, I'd probably sort by length so that it goes from shortest to longest, and I have my longer films down below. Says they typically have higher budgets. Budgets not mentioned at all in this table. So hard to say. This would be the kind of new thing, right? In these would help explain, would not help explain style questions, they're really going to give you some new information. And the question is, does it kind of like explain what otherwise is kind of a trend we see in the table or something like that? So I'd be looking at my longer films. I might be looking at the like lower half of the films once I sort by length of table. And see this higher budget, say, okay, put that one on the back burner. That's not there. This is the new thing. New. And are therefore better able to afford to use Sony HD. The only medium worth using if you're making a serious film for Sundance. And what I'd be looking at, because this is another keyword, right? Sony HD, they don't, again, call out the heading of the column medium here. They're just saying Sony HD, but you familiarize yourself with the table at least a little bit here, or if not, you look at the table and see where Sony HD is, and it pretty clearly implicates the medium column. And what you'd want to see is, okay, once you've sorted by length, hard to do in PowerPoint, is the stuff toward the bottom of that column, the ones with longer lengths, do you see those same films off to the right column having a lot of Sony HD, right? So table questions are often about cross-referencing columns, right? They'd like to make you use two different columns to answer one of these statements, each one of these statements, I should say, right? You can see it in this third one. The shorter the documentary also implies length, and then just one language, a second column, right? And especially in the verbal and logic ones, you will find you're jumping all over the place, but honestly, even in the quant-based ones as well, right? Pause after a keyword, sort by that column, or at least find the column that matters. Once you've got that sorted out and you're like, okay, I'm looking at like the top side of this list. So for the third statement here, I'd be looking at the top of the length list when it's sorted by length. Once you're looking there, then you read the rest of the statement and cross-reference it with the other column. And then you reread it and reread the columns to make sure you've gone to the right place, especially when the columns have similar names, similar headings, or similar kinds of information as in the quant ones, right? Rereading is huge. That was one of my takeaways from that ill-fated YouTube presentation of me doing the data insights thing. And you can see if you watch that video toward the end, I'm kind of going over it, looking at my mistakes and thinking, okay, this is what I'm taking away from this. This is what I need to watch out for more going forward, right? Reading carefully, looking in the right places is like the skill they're testing in table questions, especially the more verbal focused table questions, but to some degree, even the math ones. It's just in the math ones, you then, after finding the relevant information, have to do the math on it. So hooray, so much to do. Hello, Samya. All right. Read, pause when you get to a keyword, look at the right thing, sort if you need to, then come back and read a little more, find the other keyword, cross-reference. When you feel like you've got an answer and you're clicking it, check one more time that you looked in the right columns. Look at the keywords, look at the columns, say, okay, yeah, those are the places I looked, I'm good. And it takes time. The double checks take time, and you want to have practiced them so much that they just become second nature. You don't have to pause and remind yourself to do it, and they're not taking a long time because they're just kind of what you do. Similarly, you want to practice reading in pieces because that is not a very normal way to read. All right, but I found that on Data Insights, it's kind of the only way to read that's going to keep you safe. Don't read that whole statement at once, or read it all at once, but then come back to the beginning, pause after you get a keyword and look at just that one thing. Because if you read the whole statement at once, you've got 2 or even 3 columns implicated in it. And if you're like trying to keep those all in mind as you go back to the table, it is really, really easy to look at the wrong columns. Moreover, what typically happens in these statements is whichever keyword they mention first, that's often the best column to sort by. Not always, case by case for sure, but it's often the best column to sort by. And so pausing after you get to your first keyword, looking at the right column, sorting by that column and stuff like that is, it's just good practice, right? Highly recommended. All right, so recognizing keywords, huge in table questions, huge in MSR questions, huge in graph questions. Not as big in two-part analysis questions, though, especially in the two-part logic questions, it's pretty big. And two-part verbal, I mean, verbal is kind of all about keywords to some degree. Oh, great question. Utkarsh asks, is the table type question the one that contains the highest back and forth for every column, ultimately consuming much time? And Kanika is saying, no, it's MSR. And yeah, it's absolutely MSR. Because in MSR, you also have a lot of back and forth, except your back and forth is between like the different tabs and there's like a lot of text on them and it can take forever. So yeah. MSR is more that, but again, because MSR is not really a good candidate for skips, because again, it's 3 questions bundled with that one prompt, tables might still be a good candidate for a skip especially if you're not like super successful on tables or more successful on tables than on other question types. Tables can be good candidates for skips because they are time consuming. Like you have this whole table, which can be a very long table, 25 rows. I've definitely seen a couple of times. You got this whole table and then these 3 things to answer. Usually one of those 3 things is going to be harder than the other ones. So like back to this one, you can see like, I mean, these are all maybe much of a muchness, but just the second one has more text than the other ones. And that's more opportunity to kind of mess it up, look at the wrong thing, miss a detail or something like that, right? And sometimes, especially in the like more quantitative ones, it's even more pronounced that one of those statements is more difficult than the other 2. And that can end up taking a lot of time for what counts as just a single question. So even though MSR tends to, for me at least, and for a lot of people, require more time, Kaniko's with me on this, table questions, because they're one-off questions, can be good candidates for just skips because they are still fairly time-consuming. The only reason I'm hesitant there is a lot of people find that they're a bit more successful on table questions than they are on the other types. And if that's the case, again, whatever type you find you have more success on, if it's taking you more time, I mean, practice it and bring that time down, find some heuristics for it. But if you're getting to like test day and you're accurate on tables, but you take more time on tables, buy yourself the time to spend on tables because you want to get the questions right. And instead, guess quickly on a couple of questions that you have a lower success rate on, like maybe data sufficiency or something, or, you know, an equivalent success rate on, but that you can make faster educated guesses on or something like that. All right. Data Insights is a complicated beast. In graph questions, keywords kind of play out the same way. It's down in these statements. Certainly in the blurb, you get some key information. And anytime a question gives you a blurb, like this one, this has a paragraph about magnitudes and stuff under the graph. A lot of table questions have blurbs as well. If they give you a blurb, the read in pieces thing also applies to the blurb. Don't read that whole paragraph at once and then just go straight down to the thing. Read that paragraph 1 sentence at a time. If it's a particularly long sentence, break it up into 2 pieces and go and look at the graph in between. So you read a sentence, you look at the graph. This one says, for instance, in the diagram, the y-axis represents the number of earthquakes that took place around the world on 6 successive days as recorded by the U.S. Geological Survey. Go up there, look at the y-axis. We've got on the y-axis all these numbers, and the title says number of earthquakes. This sentence says the y-axis represents number of earthquakes. So you look at that and you kind of acknowledge in your head, okay, we're talking about something on a scale of like under 200, but in the hundreds mostly in terms of number of earthquakes on these 6 days, right? And look, that first piece of information maybe doesn't give you any insights you wouldn't have gathered just by looking at the graph anyway. But it's getting in the habit of reading a bit, looking, reading a bit, looking. The first sentence always makes you let your guard down in the blurbs because the first sentence is usually where they convey the most obvious information possible. But from then on, the sentences can carry a lot of maybe unexpected, certainly important information. And if you read them all in one gulp, you're going to miss some of that information, right? Similarly, down when you get to the statements that you're supposed to fill in with what would be drop downs, not the word select with a line under it. When you get down there, there are also going to be keywords, right? So the proportion of a day's earthquakes that registered a 3 or higher on the Richter scale was greatest on, and you have days as your selection in that particular drop down, right? The keywords there, registered a 3 or higher on the Richter scale, right? How do you know? Because it's a reference to something that's in the legend here. It's a reference to a specific part of these bars, right? The darkest part at the top of these bars. And so a big part of the challenge across the board on Data Insights, but again, specifically on tables, graphs, and MSR is make sure you're looking in the right place. I cannot tell you the number of people I've had look at a question like this and accidentally start looking at like the middle gray bar or the lowest, the white bar here or something like that, right? Very, very common to do that. And that's just a keyword misalignment, right? And so if you're reading for keywords, if you're pausing after keywords, if you're rereading keywords, you're a lot more likely to catch what are otherwise very much engineered careless errors on the part of the makers of the GMAT, right? Like a lot of times you make these mistakes and come away from it and say, well, that was dumb. I got to be more careful, right? But what I'm trying to convey to you here is how you be more careful is what matters, right? How you're going to be more careful. You can't just say, I'm going to read more slowly, but you can say, I'm going to read in pieces. I'm going to stop after every keyword. I'm going to reread these things, right? These are specific things you can do to be more careful. You might find that like taking notes on the keywords, just that act of writing a little bit down helps you to focus better when you're reading it and process it better than you might otherwise. You might find like mouthing the words to yourself helps you to process it better than you might otherwise. Sadly, you can't talk to yourself during the test, but that might well be a thing too. Don't get used to it when you're studying because you can't do it on the test. Either way, you might find something else that works for you, but the priority is reading carefully. And on graph questions and table questions, that's both in the blurb and in the statements down below. You're reading for keywords, you're pausing after keywords, you're double checking, or you're going to get in trouble. The harder the questions get, the more sophisticated their language traps get. And so that's the thing to watch out for. Right? Now, another part of doing well, and this is especially down to like saving time on these questions, locating the relevant information, right? This is the thing that you have to do in verbal as well. Like in quant problems, basically everything they give you is relevant information. You guys will know if you've studied quant that you use just about every piece of information in the problem, right? But on verbal, especially in reading comprehension, and on data insights, especially in everything but data sufficiency pretty much, and two-part analysis to some degree, you're getting more information than you need, right? That's like one of the hallmarks of a table or graph question. You've got like more bars in that graph question we were just on than you need to use to answer it. You've got many more rows and columns in the table than you'll truly need to answer even all three of the statements usually, right? So a big part of what they're testing is, can you see these keywords and know exactly what that means you should look at, which is what we've been talking about, right? Do you anticipate tricks like similarly named columns, similarly natured columns, like information in the columns, as on that BTUs table that have the wrong statements, and stuff like that. Now, the other thing though is, can you find the best candidate for any given job, right? And what that tends to mean is like, look, they'll ask table questions sometimes in which they'll say the proportion of this column to that column was greatest in this year or something like that. And what you'd really want to do then is say, all right, I don't want to like find the proportion of this to that for every single year if they've got 10 years listed. What I want is to find the year that's going to give this one that they're mentioning the best run for its money, right? That, you know, has like the biggest number for what would be the numerator of that proportion or the smallest number for what would be the denominator of that proportion, and see if popping them into the calculator, that one gives you a higher proportion than whatever they're claiming has the highest proportion. That is a key skill to saving yourself time on data insights, and it is a hard skill to develop. Basically, you're not supposed to use every piece of information, but they want you to be clever about which pieces of information are most promising and so most worth actually looking at. All right. Coming back to this one, right? The way that might play out is, look, you can calculate the proportion of all these like small or smallest in each bar dark gray sections to the actual numbers, right? If I'm looking at, say, this one, it looks like this dark gray section is about going from about 119 to maybe 132, right? So we're talking about 13 things that are 3 or greater, 132 or so in that whole bar. And so the proportion is about 1/10, right? 1 to 10. Day 3 to total, or sorry, reading of 3 to total, about 1 to 10, right? You can do that, and you can do that precisely for all these things. But if you know that what's going to help a proportion be better is if the numerator, the lead number, is higher, or if the denominator is smaller, you can probably just ignore this one here, because 17th of February has both things going on, right? It has a bigger dark gray portion than this one, and you can kind of just see that visually. In fact, aside from this one over here, it has the biggest dark gray portion, right? And it has a relatively small total, certainly compared to the 15th of February, definitely compared to the 14th of February, right? Love quakes, those are. And so 17th is looking pretty strong. Now, at that point, I'd look at the dropdown, and if the dropdown gives me the options 15th of February, 17th of February, 19th of February. You can have anywhere from 3 to maybe about 5 or 6 selections in the dropdown. I don't have to do any work then, because I know 17th is going to beat those other two. But if the dropdown gives me 14th, 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th, let's say, it gives me all those, then I'm going to say, okay, you know what? Of all of these, 17th handily beats 18th, 16th, and 15th. It has a bigger dark gray portion and either the same total roughly as the other ones or smaller total than the other ones. So there's no point to checking 15th, 16th, and 18th if those are in your dropdown. But if the 14th is in your dropdown with the 17th, that one is worth actually testing. And that's what I mean when I say that you should kind of find the best candidate for the job, for testing against, for giving whatever you think is the default winner a run for its money, that sort of thing, right? If I were doing this first one, I would basically look at the 17th, think that's a winner, look at the dropdown. If 17th is mentioned and 14th is not, I'm picking it. If 17th and 14th are both mentioned, I'll put 14th in the calculator just to see if it somehow ekes out a victory over the 17th. But I'm going in with some skepticism, all right? What I don't want to be doing, what we don't have time to be doing, is testing every single day. All right. That's the idea behind finding your best information. That is always one of the ways to cut down on time, especially in table questions, graph questions, MSR if you can do it, but I still haven't quite cracked it yet. Even in data sufficiency questions, so it takes a slightly different form in data sufficiency questions. We talked about best candidate for the job a little bit in terms of making an educated guess in data sufficiency questions, but the kind of the shortening of time in data sufficiency questions usually comes down to essentializing. Looking at the question stem, what are the unknowns that I really need? Looking at the statements, how do they address the need for those unknowns, all right? So those are the big skills. Those are the big kind of grist for the mill, getting answers right, getting them quickly, not getting answers unintentionally wrong skills for data insights. Now, question came up though, and it's Pranshul asking the excellent questions. Yeah, but how do you study effectively for this stuff? And this is where I think a lot of people have an opportunity to improve their study practices, right? Because coming away from question you practice, one, if you got it wrong, you absolutely want to understand why you got it wrong, how it happened, and you want to be thinking of takeaways, what am I going to do differently to avoid getting that wrong? And sometimes, granted, there will be just knowledge gaps, just I didn't know this is maybe a combinations question, or it requires combinations formula, permutations formula, and you say, oh, I hadn't really studied the combinations formula yet, so that's my takeaway there. Got to get to that, right? But certainly toward the end of your studies, when you're doing a lot more practice problems, because you kind of have been exposed to all the different topics and all the different looks and stuff like that, and you're just kind of iterating and finding takeaways, that's when your takeaways shift a lot from knowledge-based takeaways, facts and rules and stuff like that you didn't previously know, but you learn from the problem or are reminded of from the problem, to skills-based takeaways. Now, a lot of the skills you need for data insights do transfer over from other sections. A lot of the topic stuff you need for data insights transfers over from other sections. From quant, as you see there, it's particularly data insights leans into statistics, percents, ratios, fractions, proportions, whatnot. Translations as well, especially in two-part analysis questions, you'll be given word problems and have to do some like algebraic translation or at least benefit from it. And in data sufficiency questions, if they're giving you kind of a classic quant word problem, you're often best off doing some translations on those questions, right? So a lot of what you'd kind of consider the like knowledge-based skills, they transfer quite readily over from quant and verbal, some more of those like soft skills too. So like, as we saw, you'll see some kind of explicit reading comprehension and critical reasoning style questions on the data insights section. But on the more kind of subtle level, like you're going to need to be doing those things from reading comprehension, like sifting through the passage to find just the keywords, right? And ignoring a lot of the rest of the stuff, making inferences all the time, rereading parts of the passage, or, the conclusion of the argument or things like that to do well. So a lot of those soft skills come over from verbal as well. A lot of the more test-takey skills from quant come over, like making up smart numbers, like working backwards from the answer choices, like rereading the question before you finalize an answer and all kinds of stuff like that. All right. But if you do this practice, right, and you you get some questions wrong, you get some questions right, and you go and you look at the ones you got wrong and you're like, oh, that's so silly, I need to be more careful or whatever. Or even if you come away with like a more specific takeaway, like, okay, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to double read everything from now on. I'm going to read it twice, just commit to it. I think like if I read it once initially and then I read it when I'm halfway through working on the problem, I find that I hypothesize even that I'll catch a lot of my careless mistakes that way. You come away from a problem with that takeaway, and if you write that takeaway down with the problem, or if you just keep it in your head as though it's something that's going to stay there forever, you will be hampering your own progress. Okay. One of the most important things you can do in your late stage studying is keep a skills log. All right. It's just like, for some of you who are doing an error log, it's kind of related to an error log, but the emphasis is less on the topics and the knowledge from the topics and stuff like that, and more on habits, things you want to be doing differently and when you want to be doing them differently. All right. So like, consider, for instance, this problem that we saw a little bit earlier, right? It is very much a straight quant question in two-part form. It's got this jointly consistent thing going on with it, right? And we won't get all that in depth with it, but essentially, like, you can see up here that there are no numbers given in the problem. There's an X% and a Y% and stuff like that, right? And so you go about doing this problem. Maybe you get it right. Maybe you get it wrong. Maybe you take too long to do it. Maybe you get it right, but you take too long to do it. Maybe you get it right, but you've taken a responsible amount of time. If you've got it right and you've taken a responsible amount of time, you probably don't have any takeaways from this problem worth writing down, unless you got it right in a way that even surprised you, where you're like, oh, I'm glad I saw that. I don't usually do problems this way, but I kind of like, it really worked here. Then you want to note down a skills takeaway from it. But certainly if you got the problem wrong, not due to a lack of knowledge, like you look at this and you're like, but I know percents, I know translations, I should be able to get it. So you got the problem wrong, not necessarily due to a lack of knowledge, but maybe a lack of skill or practice. Or you got the problem right, but you took too long on it, and there is likely a more efficient approach to it. Always in your late stage studying, do the problem a second time on your own, explore it, try to find efficiencies, try to find places you could cut down on the time, try to find your own way to the right answer from whatever wrong answer you initially picked, right? Do the problems, redo the problems on your own before you go to an explanation in your late stage studying, because that's the only way to really get your skills better. Right? Explanations don't help as much with that. Explanations are helpful when your knowledge is lacking, less helpful when your skills are lacking, because they'll just tell you how to do the problem and you didn't have to like strengthen your skills necessarily at all. Give yourself time to explore. But one of the most crucial elements to your studying well in the late stages, in the like practicing stages, keep a skills log, right? Your skills log can look like different things, but I've got an example of one here. So like, looking at this problem, you might come away from it saying, okay, one of the skills I take away from this is like, if I'm doing a two-part one, it's quant one, I should see if I can eliminate any answers pretty quickly, right? Because the text of this problem makes it pretty clear, raise the price of each widget to X% of the original price. If they're raising the price and it's ending at X% of the original price, one of the things you can do there is eliminate the like top 3 answer choices for X, right? You can't like increase something to 25% of its original price. Making it 25% of its original price would be a decrease. They say increase, so nah. it's got to be one of those bigger numbers. And likewise for y, you might see on like reflection or even the first time you do the problem, you can eliminate those three answers. And if you are going to be testing out answers, which you often are in a jointly consistent question such as this one, cutting down on the answer choices that are available to you to test out is great. It makes life faster. But maybe your takeaway from this one is, I should set up a table, right? I should have set up a table that could have helped me keep it organized. I look at my scratch work afterwards and it was all over the place, and I tried it again and I set up a table and it was great. Or I tried it again, didn't do any better, looked at the explanation. They said set up a table. So I think like setting up a table is a good takeaway from this one. It probably is. It actually is a really good takeaway from this one. But you'd also have to know when that takeaway applies. Like, when are you going to use this set up a table skill? What is it about this problem that invites table use? Because if you essentialize that, if you generalize from this one, then you're going to know when you can use that skill in later problems. And all of this is basically part of a good error log. It's part of a good skills log. All right. So here's a bit of a sample skills log, including like a lot of the skills you might have used, you might have employed in that very problem. Right. So, for instance, that problem had this kind of archetypical x times y equals z setup. If you're translating it, it was about, I want to say like price per item and the numbers of items. Yeah, price per widget and the number of widgets sold, right? So price times quantity equals total. Very, very common formula, but this is the same formula that is at the heart of all rate problems. Rate times time equals distance. Rate times time equals work. It's basically also the average formula. It's used in a lot of cases on the GMAT, right? And it's used here too. What makes this one use here too? It's like a price per item. It's giving you a rate. If you see the word each or every or something per something, in all those cases you have a rate, and you're probably going to have at least one equation in such problems that looks like this, right? So that could be a takeaway from this one. Using a table, as I mentioned, could very much be a takeaway from this one. But you have to have a place in your skills log for, okay, but when am I going to do that, right? Because if you just say, hey, use a table, you don't know when to do it, you're never going to be able to use that, right? Or it'll be incredibly haphazard. That takeaway, that skill will kind of stay dormant until you know when to use it. And maybe you don't know right away from the first problem. Maybe you like see another problem later and you've got use a table in your skills list as a thing you want to do, but you don't really know where to use it. Use it with a problem that includes, I don't know yet, because there are a lot of things going on in this problem, right? But then you see another problem and you think, oh, I should use a table here, or you don't, and you look at the explanation. They're like, you should have used a table here. Well, then you can cross-reference it. So you'd come here and you'd say, okay, use a table as a skill. Hey, I've already got that skill written down for this other problem, and like definitely list any problem in which you see it happening so that you can later go back and cross-reference it, right? You see, okay, here's another question on which I should use a table. Now, because you can cross-reference the one previously you could use a table on, you might look at them and say, okay, what do they have in common? And one of the things that really invites table use is before and after things, right? Like before a change, after a change, or, you know, Tuesday, Wednesday, or A versus B problems in general, like, you know, day shift versus night shift, or let's say tenured professors versus adjunct professors or stuff like that, right? If you have an A and B problem, if you have a before and after problem, it's usually a good idea to set out a table, right? That's what you really want to come away from it with. And that way, every time you see a new problem which you could use a table, you add it to this list of problems that use this skill. You also can have a column and should have a column for exercises to practice this skill. So like for a lot of them, it's just going to be, okay, you know what? I think I can use a table in any kind of before or after problem. Let me scan through some problems, see if I can find another one like it, and see, would a table be appropriate here? In that respect, the official guide can be really helpful because it's easy to flip from page to page and see features and problems. But basically, these skills are going to be triggered by certain features in problems. And that's the heart of a skills log. What features tell you to use what skills? And if you're tracking them, you're writing down what skills you've used. That forces you to articulate and put a name to them, right? It then forces you to see commonality among other problems in a way that's not purely topic-based, the way we're all kind of used to doing it, right? Here's a statistics data sufficiency problem. Here's a statistics table problem. I got them both wrong. I got to get better at statistics. No, if you got the data sufficiency one wrong because of a statistics foible, but you got the table one wrong because you looked at the wrong column, those are not the same takeaways, right? Those are like, you don't get the same kind of skills advice from those two problems. You get very different skills advice from those two problems, okay? And so focusing on skills, having a place to write down those skills, to articulate them, to see where you're getting the same skill come up again and again, and to start adding to, I can do it here, I can do it here, I can do it here. I've seen it in these problems. I'm going to try this drill to do it a little bit better, right? Like smart numbers. I'm going to go and find like 5 problems in the official guide in which I can use smart numbers that maybe look like the X and Y problem or something like that. Absolutely. Like that is what you need to do. Now, I'm not saying you need to create a takeaway for every problem you do. That becomes too cumbersome and you don't really want to do it. But what I am saying is, if you keep seeing like more and more problems that get like added to, say, this column, problems that use the skill, and you're still getting them wrong, that's a pretty good sign that that's an important skill and one you really want to hammer down, right? And the only way you're going to do so is not only by making this skills log and taking some care with it, right? But by dedicating at least 1 day a week in your late stage studying to follow up on those skills, right? I'm going to do some of these exercises I've devised to reinforce these skills, or I'm just going to find some other problems with this feature if I can and try to use these skills deliberately. Because with skills, the goal is to turn them into habits. Habits basically involve 3 components: a trigger, the activity, and the reward, right? And a lot of people, when they're studying, just focus on the activity. I need to do this. Without a trigger, never going to happen. All right. The reward is usually you get the problems right, or you get the problems more quickly and stuff like that. But the only way you're going to change your habits is if you deliberately practice a new habit. You mindfully practice a new habit, right? And the only way you're really going to be able to do that when you're doing a bunch of practice problems and everything can blur together very easily within a set, or, you know, across sets over different days of the week or whatever, having a central repository for your skills to come back to, institutionalizing coming back to it once a week, to finding follow-up problems for skills, especially that you've got a lot of hits on and stuff like that. That is the way you upgrade your habits ahead of the test, so that you don't get to the test and have to like keep reminding yourself, what is the skill? What was the skill? Or like go down a list of skills and say, could I use this one here? Could I use this one here? No, you want to turn it into second nature, but everybody needs a little bit of help upgrading their habits, tracking them, figuring out when to use them, articulating that stuff, and then using that as a springboard to deliberately practicing those skills is the only real way to improve there. And because data insights is such a skills-based thing, because so many of your mistakes are going to be about how you read, how you got tricked, you know, how efficiently you managed to approach a problem, because time is so tight on data insights and stuff like that, this is pretty essential to studying well for it after the first like couple of weeks of your studying it. And this is true across the board on the test. But since we're talking about data insights, shout out goes to that. All right. With that, you guys, I'll leave you with this. Thank you all for coming to the session. So happy for your questions. If you have any other questions, put them in the comments. Somebody will get to them. I might get to them. Put them there now. But otherwise, keep coming, you guys. Next quarter is going to be exciting. Remember, if there are certain sessions you want to see covered in the next 3 months on these GMAT Club YouTube videos, GMAT Club's cool. They're responsive. They will take that into account. Put that in the comments. Say what you're struggling with. Say what you could use some more insights on. They will find an expert or me to help you with that stuff. Okay. All that said, you guys, if you have any interest in Manhattan Prep at all, absolutely, you can find me on LinkedIn or just out there somewhere. Feel free to reach out. There's a promo kind of always going for people who come to these sessions to save a little bit of money on our courses. And we have free trial classes that you should definitely feel free to come to. All right. With that, I'm gonna wish you all a great day/night/life, and I'll see you hopefully sometime in the next quarter, you guys. Thank y'all. One last question I see from Pranshul, who deserves the questions answered. Such good questions. Other than DI for verbal, how to be better at pacing in the last 2 mocks, scored a V83. Usually, I guess on the last 2 due to lack of time. Burn critical reasoning questions along the way. But if you want to just get like better at like being faster overall, one, see where your time is spent. If it's too much time reading, you might have to do a bit of a lighter read on reading comprehension. If it's too much time debating between 2 answer choices, practice will help, but articulating what's like wrong with the wrong answers and right with the right answers as you practice will help. And if it's, if it's anything else, it might just come down to spacing out a couple of skips, because you certainly don't want to run out of time in the section, all right? And Vishal asks, does the sequence of the 3 sections affect the difficulty level? It's kind of an open question right now, but I think the consensus is yes, somewhat. That at least where you start out on a section kind of depends on where you ended up on the previous section. So can do a little bit. Yeah. That is at least what I've been hearing from pretty reliable sources. I don't know that GMAT has totally confirmed it, so take it with a pinch of salt. But there's at least a very strong chance that that is the case. And if that affects how you order your sections, I could understand that. I might well order my sections differently the next time I take the test. All right, great questions here at the end. Thank you all. See you at the next rodeo.